I'm Valerie Escobar with Mariner Wealth Advisors. I'm a certified financial planner and host of Your Life Simplified. I'm here with Michael MacKelvie, also a certified financial planner. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Valerie?
Good. Any big events over the weekend for you?
Yeah, actually, they had Seafair up here in Seattle, which is the air show. It's out over the water, Lake Washington. I mean, it was unreal. I've never been that close to jets, so I'm still kind of like rattled a little bit from it. I feel like I was pulling some G's just even watching these guys, but it was fun. How about you?
That's awesome. Cool. Now I just
Yeah.
got back from a trip to Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah, ate lots of, pizza and hot dogs and
Lots of Chicago food.
oh my gosh, great architecture. It was a good time. So,
Nice.
but yeah, and it was really interesting because when we were there, I have two stepkids and they're 19 and 21. And there was a lot of conversation about like, wouldn't it be cool to do this and that? And you live in a big city like this or go to school out here. And, you think back when you're 17, 18, what kind of state of mind were you in? Did you know exactly where your life was going to be and what you were going to do next at that point?
No. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I always tell kids when I'm doing these classes is, that's okay. Like you shouldn't. Like theoretically, how could you know what you want to do for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah.
But I think, one of the more telling parts of your life is, when you go to your parents and you ask them a question and you realize that they don't know the answer or they potentially know less than you do about it. There's a transition to individuality there that is, I think, pretty interesting. I think it really starts to occur. I don't know if this is the case for you, but in those late teenage years where you've kind of had this godlike complex of your parents, and then all of a sudden you're getting ready for the other side of this structure of high school, and you realize you don't really have that gatekeeper in the same way.
Right.
They maybe don't have the answers like you've always looked up to them for. I think that's a difficult transition for any kid, right?
For sure. And what's really interesting too is that it's during this pivotal time when you're really not completely self-aware and don't know a lot about the world, although you maybe think you do, is when we're trying to, in our society in the United States, that's when you have to start making decisions. Which college are you going to
Right.
go to? How much are you going to spend to get there? What kind of career are you going to have?
Right.
And that's really what we wanted to talk about today. How do we make those decisions? How do we pay for those decisions? And, really, what do we go? Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Over in the 21st century, tuition has more than doubled. So that's about annually a growth rate of 6.8%. If we could get a guaranteed growth rate like that on an investment, then,
Sign
we'd
me
all
up.
feel pretty confident. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's not the case. And so just being able to have a plan for this is going to be extremely helpful. And Mike, I know that this is something that you're passionate about and that you've worked with in the past. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, and maybe you can relate to this as well, but I remember the first year I was in the business, I was filling out a Roth IRA application, doing paperwork by hand, and before DocuSign, and this other advisor walked by, and I remember he said something that really struck me. I don't think it really occurred to him at the moment that it carried as much weight as it did, as often is the case. But he said, you're not going to be opening up many more of those. And what he meant by that was, as time goes on, you grow as an advisor, you're maybe working with more people that are wealthy because, they can't contribute to a Roth IRA. They make too much money to be able to contribute to one. And I remember that like really sat with me. It was a little bit of an existential moment. And I was still thinking about it like the next day. And I thought, hey, what's a crowd as I grow as an advisor that, I know I would stand to gain nothing from financially. So I don't just think about the future and say, yeah, I'm just going to be working with rich people. Not that I don't enjoy the complexity of that, but it was a legitimate fear. And I didn't learn anything about finance in high school. As I mentioned, like you kind of go to your parents for these questions and you realize, wait a second, they might not know that much about it either. So I reached out to a bunch of teachers and said, hey, be curious if I could come in and maybe just be a guest speaker. And they were all like, hey, yeah, sure, come on in. And kind of grew into this program, which eventually became Financial Futures. And on Fridays, we teach this What is Wealth class, either in person or virtually. And it was fun. But that was, really the first step into it. And then
Hmm.
from there, a counselor said, hey, would you be willing to talk to a different student, the parents? I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, would you come in for a college night? And
Oh, great. Where you're
yeah,
dedicated to the parents, not just the kids.
yeah. So and I was like, sure. So when you go into those moments, you try to prepare in the best way that you can, but you really don't have any understanding of like where people's knowledge base is at. And I was blown away at the gap. These were great parents, obviously really cared about their kids, but the gap in knowledge for the college planning process was unbelievable for these parents of kids that would be leaving the home in less than 20 months. I mean, these were junior parents, some of them senior parents. And about half of them said, hey, I'd like to schedule a consultation, just talk about what I can do with this. And that's kind of how it got started. Eventually ended up being a lot more high schools, but that's how it got going.
Yeah. So then, and I mean, that is what's always surprising is that it's like doing your taxes too, right? It's like this thing that so many people have to do, and it's incredibly complex, and you're just sort of
Yeah.
thrown into it. And so as you're going into that, what did you find to be the most surprising really about the college planning landscape? Um,
By far, that the sticker price of college is irrelevant if you know how to shop for college. So what you see as the advertised price is somewhat irrelevant, and you learn very quickly that there's kind of this marketing game of sorts that's involved, uh, at least certainly with the private schools, to illustrate a value of sorts by attaching a much higher price tag. But the discrepancy in what the sticker price is versus what you can pay is, I mean, it blew me away. Like, for example, the last school that I went to, Regis, had about a $60,000 inflation adjusted cost in today's dollars. And I paid $8,000 all in. And I only went there for 1 year. And I remember just thinking, like, what is going on here? Like, how is this possible? But there's this whole labyrinth of what's called merit money. There's
mhm.
this whole labyrinth of just the traditional federal financial aid. There's obviously like what things the kid can do, how you save for it as a parent, how you pay for it, how you spin down off of different assets. And um, more than anything, it was the surprise that, hey, like everybody talks about this insane cost that's there, and it is a large cost, but there is so much that you can do to drive that cost down, even for the right school, not just saying, hey, I'll settle for this. I mean, legitimately for a number of great schools here in the US.
Right. So it's not necessarily coming up with a lot of money, but there's also, kind of the way you approach the schools to just to reduce the costs themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's, again, like people think like, oh, like how can I best afford this? And they think 529 or,
Hmm.
uh, you know, just pay for it out of pocket, I guess, student loans. And those are important elements to the equation for sure. But there really is this entire underground system that people are just completely unaware of, that you can get so much money if you do it the right way. And as is the case, you mentioned the complexity of this, right?
Yeah.
When there's that complexity, there will be people that figure it out, weed through the complexity, and they find the savings. And then there's a lot of us that maybe just get paralyzed or they don't know what to do. And maybe there's some negligence, maybe there's some oversight, and they end up with a much larger bill than they otherwise would have had to pay.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's talk about the savings piece first, right? I mean, obviously, I think we want to know what these secrets are for reducing the costs and just getting the best inside track. But okay, 529s, right? That's kind of that buzzword. Everyone knows about that. That's I would say the most common ways of doing that. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that tool is?
Yeah, it really is the most common tool. And I think sometimes I'm glad you brought that up. It's confused as the solution for savings, right? So, like, you know, it's kind of like when you realize the marketing game has won, like when Kleenex, who's the company, is referred to as the solution, which is just, some type of tissue paper, right?
Right.
That's kind of what's happened with the 529. But it is a wonderful tool. The problem again here is the complexity. I mean, you're like, oh yeah, I'll save to a 529. And then you step into it and you realize, wait, there's over 50 different 529s out there. I mean, many states have multiple, and you can
Hmm.
contribute to other states, and there's different tax benefits and different fund options, right? But the benefit here of a 529, just largely speaking, without getting too deep into, well, which one really makes sense for me, is the ability to get tax-free growth and tax-free distribution if it's used for higher education. And the context of higher education is, I would say, decently broad. And so you have a wonderful opportunity here to just save a bunch of money on taxes and, really set aside some money for education that you can fund in a much more efficient way. So that's a lot of times where people look at them. Again, unfortunately, it's not as straightforward as you maybe would hope. Uh, where it's just, hey, all I got to do is put money into this thing, and that's going to really take care of the rest.
Right, right. And that's a big thing when, obviously working with a planner, because there's limits, and there's a lack of, there's some lack of flexibility as to what you use the money for. And, what if my kid doesn't end up going to college? And, there are tactics and ways that you can change the beneficiary, or, do different things. If there's a scholarship, you can, receive some of that money without having to pay a penalty. But
Right.
let's say that we are looking for a little bit more flexibility. What other options, would you recommend?
Yeah, understandable. Because the biggest fear of 529 is, well, what if they don't go to school? What if we don't need it for college? Rarely the case, I will say. It's very rare that I see somebody that's oversaved into a 529, because you can change the beneficiaries to other kids. But if you are looking for more flexibility, and this is typically something that I advise for a chunk of what you're saving for college, um, a Roth IRA is strangely a great tool to use. So, IRA, individual retirement account, a lot of times, things change as things progress, and suddenly certain tools actually apply. And that's kind of how the Roth works. So the reason why the Roth is maybe an attractive tool is you can always take out your basis from the Roth. Now, if you use any of the growth, so let's say you put 10,000, it grew to 20,000, and you said, I want to take the full 20,000 out for college, you would have to pay taxes on that growth. It was used for college prior to the retirement 59 and a half line that they have in the sand for us here. But um, the basis can always be used. That is what you've contributed for college. And that's a huge benefit, because, like, okay, if we don't need this money, we at least know that the monies are in a Roth IRA, and, we can use it for retirement. So maybe you're saving to, for example, your Roth 401k. If you're at an employer and you can't afford, you make too much money for a Roth IRA, you maybe save through your Roth 401k and you later convert that to an IRA. Or maybe your kid's working, and this is getting too much into it, but maybe they set one up, although that might affect their financial aid calculations more because it's in their name. So a lot of things to take into account here, but the Roth is definitely another vehicle that makes sense. There's a couple
Mhm.
others too.
Yeah,
But
no, and I mean, like you said, Roth is something that's a really valuable tool. And so, if you're putting money in and then you just take it right back out for college because that's where you decide to use it, you're not really
yeah,
losing anything, because if it ends up you didn't need it for that, then you've got a really great, powerful tax-free tool for the future.
right,
And I think you made that distinction that you can have your own Roth as a parent, and then you can also set up a Roth for your kid. And then if it's your kid, because they're working, they have to have earned income to do it. It is in their name, so they do have that
right,
control. Which leads us to the next part where we're talking about UTMA or UGMAs, right?
right.
And so again, control. Who's got the control? And sometimes you're thinking about, okay, what exactly is my 16, 18-year-old kid maturity level, especially when it comes to money? And so sometimes putting money in their name may be a little scary. Can you
Yeah,
talk on that as to what those types of accounts are?
it should be. um, it's a custodial account, but again, I mentioned at the beginning of this that, there's this transition that really does occur where, the kid is gaining more independence, and what that means is you have to be willing to let them make more decisions. Maybe one of those decisions is managing their own accounts at some point in time. So UTMA, UGMA, they're custodial accounts. You set them up for your kid. The challenge is eventually they're going to take ownership of that. So as soon as you put it into that account, at some point it's going to be theirs, right? You can still kind of manage the assets while the child is underneath what's called the age of majority, but at some point this will be their account, and there's an understandable fear with that in case they want to just blow it at like frat parties or something like that in their first couple of years of college. But the monies, the reason why you would do it is tax savings. The monies grow at a much lower tax rate typically because most kids aren't killing it yet. At least they're not doing as much from an income standpoint as their parents, which means the growth on that account is going to be at a lower tax rate. And so that's, a big reason why you would ever set this up, is to transition money to that next generation in a tax efficient way.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the obvious risk that's there is they will gain control of that money at some point in time. I usually follow it up with, hey, they're going to gain control of virtually every decision at some point in time.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I like to, we need to educate our kids, right? It
Yeah.
can't just be like when they are 21 or 24, whatever it is, they get their first job, that they somehow magically understand how their checkbook
Yeah.
work, or even realize that having a credit card is impactful for the future. And there's just so many things that we sort of take for granted that we learned along our adult lives,
Totally.
that should be taught. And so, yeah, having those accounts where the kids are managing them and are responsible, I think is hugely important. But if we're afraid and we're saying, I just don't feel comfortable with that yet. I think another powerful tool that I like to just recommend, is a good old fashioned brokerage account, where the parents are being able to save, and,
Flexible.
paying taxes on money that you make. There are worse problems to have. You're making money. And so we're looking at, capital gains rates versus ordinary income. So I think
Yeah,
that is a valid tool as well, for looking
definitely.
at college, saving up for college.
Yeah,
Any other thoughts on
definitely.
your side as far as future school?
Sometimes people look at like the educational IRA, the Coverdell,
Mm,
because it has the word education in it. I personally am not a big fan of those. It rarely seems to make sense over 529. Like 529, as time has gone on here, has just gotten benefit after benefit added to it. I mean, there's ways to, stuff a ton of money into this into just 1 year, even beyond the state, deductible amounts you might get if you get a little tax credit or deduction, through your state's plan. Um, but, I think the brokerage account is a great just vessel to have for flexibility. It's like, hey, I know I always got this midterm bucket I can just access for any reason. Beyond that, we kind of get into the hacks, like how do we best pay for this thing?
yeah.
And that's the second generation. So it's really like the savings, and you should save through college. I want to make that distinguishing point. Like it's not just up to the senior year, right? It's really saving through college. But there's this transition that occurs into, okay, I'm now figuring out what's the best ways to pay for this thing after I've figured out what school I want to go to, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that I think is part of the program that you're working with, right? Is how to help kids navigate all of this, and the best hacks to pay for it. I think one thing I want to throw in there too, is to take a really good hard look at what you are paying for, right? So if
mm,
I'm going to go to school to be, I don't know what it is, some kind of career that I will make $30,000 out of the gate and maybe get a 3% raise every year, does it make
right,
sense to spend $120,000 on that education?
right.
And so doing I think a good hard look at that, and realizing maybe college isn't for everybody, that there are different ways to make an income, as well.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I mean, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing currently to kind of tackle the college funding debacle that's out there.
Yeah, well, that's definitely part of it, right? Is what you're speaking to is, again, like it, it's difficult for a teenager to conceptually understand, that large of a number, right? So like
Mhm.
they go from making $15 an hour and maybe having a few $100 in their savings account to being handed a six-figure credit card limit in the form of student loans. And that's just a difficult transition for anyone to take on. But yeah, it's really, about, okay, what is it that I'm trying to get out of this? Like, what is it that I'm trying to achieve here? And again, I mentioned at the beginning, like, it's really hard to know what you want to do naturally. Like, that makes sense. But we do a little bit better when we have a target.
Mhm.
And that, we have to have something that we're aiming at here. But that doesn't mean that you should just willfully stumble through the fog and have this, aimless wander of sorts where it's like, well, my heart says I really want to do this. It's like intuition feels just as good when when it's right as it does when it's wrong.
Mm.
Your heart might say that, but you might get on the other side and realize that, living in a shanty and you basically pausing your financial life for 10 to 15 years, your ability to save for your future isn't maybe worth that trade-off, right? That might be the case, right? And so I think having a little bit of just understanding the beginning, and we do this through a couple different exercises. One of them is called the compound effect, where we take a look at just how just a few dollars saved today makes such a big impact for a kid down the road.
Mhm.
And when they see that compound effect, it's pretty substantial. And when they see it with debt, it's pretty substantial too, because the compound effect goes both ways. So I think really doing everything you can to bring that future to your present self, but just understanding that, again, you do have to formulate some target. It's just about comparing yourself to who you were yesterday, not someone
Mhm.
else today, right? Just something you can be a little bit better at today, something you can aim a little bit more for today. Don't get too caught up in, well, do I absolutely want to be a graphic designer
Hmm.
in 2026 when I'm graduating? you know
Right.
there's abilities to transition, as everybody on the other side of college is aware, to other careers if it's not something that makes sense for you. But again, that's not an excuse to just say, well, I'll figure it out along the way. 100%, like, you should sit down and really spend some time to think critically about this. And that's why we have a writing exercise as well. One of the best ways to think is to
Hmm.
write. And it's I think proven to be very helpful for a lot of kids.
Yeah, no, I love that. Just the self exploration is going to
Yeah.
be vital during this period of time. And I think, the historic, you graduate from high school, you go to college 4 years later, and then you have a job. I
Right.
think, giving yourself time to and ability to break that mold and saying, you know what, maybe it's
Yeah.
going to take me a little bit longer to figure out what I want, or maybe I want to take some years off, or
Totally.
it's all okay, and it is completely valid.
It's not
Um,
wasted time. It's
yeah,
Yeah,
it's not
it's
wasted time. It's just really important.
but it doesn't mean it can't be wasted time, right? like like there's this gap year that's out there right now floating around, since I believe it was Obama's daughter kind of made it somewhat more famous, right? And a gap year can mean a lot of different things, right?
Right.
A gap year can be destructive for the wrong reasons, right? If you're maybe just doing it to just party for an entire year. But it can also be, and I'm not saying that's every kid, it can
Mhm.
also be a wonderful opportunity to kind of take a breath and really own in on something that you want to do versus just saying, I'll sign up for the $50,000 school right off the bat with no clue at all if I really want to be there, or if I really want to have that degree. Right.
Right. No, agreed. Agreed.
But
And so, I guess just to wrap this up, the parents maybe are out there thinking, okay, like, well, what do I do now? Right. So
yeah.
how do we tackle this monster? And one thing I
Yes.
would maybe suggest too is that not thinking that there is only one answer, that I have to
Yeah.
have my 529 fully funded. But taking into consideration that there is, I mean, some kids work. I had to work through
Yeah.
college, and there's always going to be some of that. There are
Totally.
scholarship opportunities if you're willing to write a few essays. There are different things that you can also do besides just forking up the cash.
Right. This is, yeah, to answer the question, I mean, this is exactly why, we've been designing this course, is to give parents and kids a formula to go through it. But it really, depends on where your kid is at in
Hmm.
school. If they're really nearing this college decision, let's say junior year, sophomore year, senior year, potentially, um, I would say first, just kind of thinking really critically about, like, where you want to go, doing a ton of due diligence on shopping on colleges, because you'll find that It just varies school to school how much money you'll get back, how much it will actually cost you. And I think really understanding that uh, reality seems to be where we have agreed upon perceptions. Therefore, there will never be an agreed upon reality for college because we're always going to have conflicting perceptions. It will always be somebody that says, you should just get in the cheapest way possible. You shouldn't go. You should go to the best private school because they have the best education. No, you should go to a big state school because that's where you're going to meet the most people and build the connections. And that's what's most valuable. There's always going to be conflicting perceptions about what's best. Therefore, there's never going to be an agreed upon reality. And you're just doing the best you can to select the college that makes sense for you. Don't worry about, I got a ton of crap for going to this junior college for my first 2 years, Eastern Arizona Junior College. And it really hit me pretty hard because I was like embarrassed to say that I was going to a JUCO, right? I mean, the classes I was taking were in a lot of ways better than the large public university I went to my junior year, and in some ways better than the private school I finished at. So, you're doing the best that you can, but there isn't an excuse here to just kind of stumble through the blindness. There's tons of hacks out there to cut the cost. You just have to get creative.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, have the conversation, start exploring, talk to your advisor.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's a difficult thing for me to sum up as far as like, here's what you should do, because again, it's so dependent on somebody's situation and what they're trying to do. But I think exploring and getting creative about ways to cut the cost, there's just so much that can be done, so many hacks to just bring this price down. And that's really in your best interest in the long run. But again, it's just whether or not you get creative and whether or not you really go after it.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you for everybody joining us today. Again, I'm Valerie Escobar, certified financial planner, joined with Michael MacKelvie, also a certified financial planner. Make sure that you subscribe at whatever platform you're listening to, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Take care, Valerie.
Bye.
Mariner Wealth Advisors, or MWA, is an SEC-registered investment advisor with its principal place of business in the state of Kansas. Registration of an investment advisor does not imply a certain level of skill or training. MWA is in compliance with the current notice filing requirements imposed upon registered investment advisors by those states in which MWA maintains clients. MWA may only transact business in those states in which it is notice filed or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from notice filing requirements. Any subsequent direct communication by MWA with a prospective client shall be conducted by a representative that is either registered or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from registration in the state where the prospective client resides. For additional information about MWA, including fees and services, please contact MWA or refer to the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website at www.advisorinfo.sec.gov. Please read the disclosure statement carefully before you invest or send money. The views expressed in this podcast is for educational purposes only and do not take into account any individual personal, financial, legal, or tax considerations. As such, the information contained herein is not intended to be personal, legal, investment, or tax advice. Nothing herein should be relied upon as such, and there is no guarantee that any claims made will come to pass. The opinions are based on information and sources of information deemed to be reliable, but Mariner Wealth Advisors does not warrant the accuracy of the information. Certified Financial Planner, trademark, CFP, registered trademark, and federally registered CFP with flame design marks, collectively the CFP registered marks, are professional certification marks granted in the United States by Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards, Inc., also CFP Board. The CFP, registered trademark, certification is a voluntary certification. No federal or state law or regulation requires financial planners to hold the CFP certification.